Everything changed the moment a single sheet of paper slid across the Thanksgiving table. Everyone else saw it as another legal document, but I knew it was something far worse. If I signed my name, I would not just be agreeing to a contract, I would be surrendering my dignity, my independence, and every ounce of respect I still had for myself. The room was silent enough that I could hear the crackling fire from the living room, yet somehow that silence felt louder than any argument I had ever survived. My name is Evelyn Carter, and for 3 years I had been married to Nathan Sterling. From the outside, people thought I had married into the perfect family. They owned luxury hotels, investment firms, and properties that stretched across several states. Their mansion looked like something pulled straight from a magazine, complete with marble floors, priceless artwork, and staff who quietly appeared whenever someone needed another glass of wine. People admired them because they believed money created class. Living inside that family taught me something very different. Wealth could hide cruelty better than anything else. Ever since Nathan introduced me to his parents, they had treated me like an outsider who somehow wandered into a place where she did not belong. They never yelled or caused dramatic scenes. Instead, they mastered the art of making someone feel invisible. Every compliment carried an insult underneath it. Every smile reminded me that I was being judged. They spoke about my childhood as though growing up with a hard-working single mother automatically made me less valuable than everyone sitting around their polished dining table. Nathan always promised things would improve with time. Every holiday he would squeeze my hand beneath the table and whisper that his parents simply needed to know me better. I believed him because I loved him. I convinced myself that patience solved everything. Unfortunately, patience only gave them more opportunities to underestimate me. That Thanksgiving evening looked perfect from the outside. The dining room glowed beneath crystal chandeliers while expensive candles filled the air with warm cinnamon and vanilla. A perfectly roasted turkey rested in the center of the table beside elegant silver dishes filled with every traditional side imaginable. It should have felt like a celebration. Instead, every person at that table looked as though they had gathered for a business meeting. Nathan avoided looking at me from the moment dinner started. His mother, Eleanor Sterling, wore her usual calm expression that never revealed emotion. His father, Charles Sterling, carved slices of turkey with slow, careful movements while his sister Olivia scrolled through her phone as though dinner bored her. Her husband, Gregory, happened to be the family attorney, and the thick envelope sitting beside his plate immediately caught my attention. After everyone finished eating, Eleanor gently folded her napkin and looked directly at me. Her smile was polite enough to fool anyone who did not know her. I knew better. Whenever she smiled like that, someone was about to leave the room feeling smaller than before. Gregory pushed the envelope toward me without saying a word. I slowly opened it and found page after page of legal language. It did not take long to understand what I was reading. It was a postnuptial agreement. If Nathan and I ever divorced, I would walk away with almost nothing regardless of what happened during our marriage. Eleanor finally broke the silence. She calmly explained that successful families needed protection and that everyone involved should appreciate clear financial boundaries. She spoke as though she were giving me valuable advice instead of stripping away every safeguard I had. Charles nodded with complete confidence while Olivia quietly laughed into her wine glass. Nathan finally spoke, but his voice barely rose above a whisper. He told me it was only paperwork and insisted that signing would keep peace within the family. I looked into his eyes hoping to find the husband who once promised he would always stand beside me. Instead, I found fear. He was terrified of disappointing his parents, and that fear mattered more to him than protecting his wife. Gregory adjusted his expensive watch before explaining that they had already reviewed my company records. According to public filings, my business earned very little compared to the Sterling Empire. He claimed the agreement was not personal, it was simply responsible planning. Olivia added that someone with my background should probably feel grateful they were offering anything at all. There it was again, my background. I had heard those words so many times that they no longer surprised me. To them, I would always be the girl who grew up in a tiny apartment while her mother worked double shifts to pay rent. They never cared enough to ask what kind of work I actually did. Years earlier, Nathan casually mentioned that I owned a technology company, and his family dismissed it as nothing more than a small startup that would probably disappear within a year. I quietly placed the papers back inside the envelope and rested both hands on the table. My heartbeat was steady. Strangely enough, I felt calmer than anyone else in the room. I looked directly at Eleanor and spoke in the softest voice I could manage. I will not sign this. The room instantly froze. Even the house staff standing near the doorway stopped moving. Nathan stared at me as though he had forgotten who I was. Charles slowly lowered the carving knife while Gregory leaned back in his chair with obvious disappointment. Eleanor never raised her voice. She simply nodded once before telling me that if I refused, the family would immediately begin the legal process of ending my marriage before the following week. She sounded as though she had already prepared for my answer long before I entered the dining room. I looked around the table and realized something important. Every person sitting there believed they held all the power. They thought I depended on their family name, their wealth, and their approval. None of them had the slightest idea who I truly was. For years I had allowed them to believe the version of me that made them comfortable. Tonight, that illusion was finally about to disappear. I slowly reached for my handbag and smiled for the first time all evening. Then I asked a question that changed every life sitting around that table. Before anyone says another word, would you mind taking out your phones and searching for one company, Nova Access Holdings? For a few seconds nobody moved. They looked at me as if I had made a ridiculous joke during the most serious conversation of the evening. Gregory smiled with quiet confidence, convinced I was trying to distract everyone from the agreement lying on the table. Eleanor folded her hands again and patiently waited for me to admit defeat. Nathan glanced between me and his parents, clearly hoping this uncomfortable moment would somehow disappear on its own. I remained completely calm because I already knew what was about to happen. Sometimes the truth is far more powerful when people discover it themselves instead of hearing it from someone else. Nathan was the first to reach for his phone. His hands shook slightly as he unlocked the screen and typed the company name into the search bar. I watched every expression cross his face. At first there was confusion, then curiosity. Finally, every trace of color disappeared from his face. He looked up at me with wide eyes before looking back at the screen as though he believed he had searched the wrong company. Charles frowned and grabbed his own phone, while Olivia rolled her eyes before doing the same. Within moments the silence became almost unbearable because every one of them was staring at the exact same information. Nova Access Holdings was not a small software company struggling to survive. It was the parent corporation behind dozens of successful technology, cybersecurity, financial, and artificial intelligence businesses operating across the country. Financial magazines listed it among the fastest-growing private companies in America. Analysts valued the company at well over $2 billion, and every article named the same founder and chief executive. My name appeared beside every headline. The family that believed they were protecting their fortune had just discovered they were sitting across from someone whose business empire was worth several times more than everything they owned combined. Nathan slowly lowered his phone without taking his eyes off me. His voice barely worked when he finally asked if I had really built the company myself. I nodded without hesitation and explained that I started writing software while most people my age were still trying to decide what career they wanted. The first product succeeded far beyond my expectations. And instead of spending money to impress strangers, I reinvested every dollar into building something that would last for generations. Success did not happen overnight. It came after years of 18-hour workdays, endless failures, sleepless nights, and sacrifices that very few people ever saw. Olivia looked completely stunned. She admitted that she thought my business was nothing more than a tiny startup operating out of a rented office. I gently reminded her that nobody in the family had ever shown enough interest to ask what my company actually did. Every conversation they started about my work ended before it truly began because they had already decided my background told them everything they needed to know. They judged my childhood instead of my character, my mother instead of my accomplishments, and my silence instead of my intelligence. I never lied to any of them. They simply never cared enough to look beyond their own assumptions. Gregory finally cleared his throat and attempted to recover control of the conversation. He insisted that my financial success changed nothing because the postnuptial agreement was designed to protect family assets, not insult me personally. His words sounded confident, but his expression told a different story. For the first time since I met him, he looked uncertain. That uncertainty grew stronger when I reached into my handbag and carefully placed another thick folder on the polished dining table. The room immediately became quiet again because everyone sensed this meeting was far from over. I opened the folder and slowly slid several documents toward Charles. They were official financial records carrying signatures, account numbers, and legal filings that had already been verified by multiple institutions. Charles studied the first page for only a few seconds before the confidence disappeared from his face. I calmly explained that about a year earlier my investment group had quietly acquired a controlling interest in the financial company responsible for refinancing several sterling commercial properties. The transaction had been completely legal, publicly recorded, and approved through every required regulatory process. The only reason they never noticed was because the ownership changed through several holding companies instead of one obvious purchase. Charles immediately stood from his chair and demanded to know whether I had planned this from the beginning. I remained seated and answered with complete honesty. I told him I never purchased those investments because of revenge. I purchased them because they were profitable opportunities. Business decisions should never be driven by emotion. The fact that those investments happened to involve his company was simply a consequence of the market. I also reminded him that if his own financial advisors had been paying closer attention, they would have recognized the ownership changes months earlier instead of discovering them during Thanksgiving dinner. Before anyone could interrupt again, I opened another section of the folder and explained that one of the Sterling development companies had recently missed an important payment connected to a commercial loan. It had triggered a technical default that gave lenders the legal right to demand immediate corrective action. I had no intention of abusing that position because destroying businesses had never interested me. Building them always brought far greater satisfaction. Even so, the reality remained the same. The family that believed they controlled every negotiation had unknowingly placed themselves in one where I held nearly every advantage. Nathan remained completely silent throughout the conversation. Every few moments he looked at me as though he were trying to remember every discussion we had ever shared. I could almost see the regret growing inside him. He finally realized that while his parents spent years measuring my value through my childhood and income, he had never truly tried to understand the woman he married either. He knew my favorite coffee order, the movies I enjoyed, and the places I wanted to travel. Yet somehow he never bothered asking enough questions to understand the life I had built before we met. That realization hurt him more than anything his parents had said all evening. I leaned back in my chair and quietly closed the folder. The room felt completely different now. Only minutes earlier they believed they were deciding my future. Now every person at the table understood that power had never belonged to them at all. I looked at Eleanor, whose calm expression had finally begun to crack beneath the weight of everything she had learned. For the first time since joining the Sterling family, she had nothing prepared to say. Gregory finally found his voice and insisted that none of this changed the reason we were gathered. He claimed the agreement was still a reasonable request, but his confidence sounded forced. I looked at him for a long moment before pulling one final document from the folder. I quietly explained that during one of my company audits, our compliance team discovered suspicious trading activity connected to an investment account he controlled. After verifying the information with outside investigators, we submitted everything through the proper legal channels. I was not accusing him of anything. I simply allowed the facts to speak for themselves. Before anyone could respond, bright headlights swept across the dining room windows. Two black SUVs rolled through the front gate and stopped outside the house. The doorbell echoed through the mansion, and one of the staff members nervously walked toward the entrance. Gregory looked toward the window, and the color disappeared from his face. He already knew why they were there. The investigators had arrived quietly, just as I requested, to avoid creating a public spectacle for the family. Nobody spoke as the silence settled over the room. Charles slowly lowered his head while Olivia stared at her husband in complete disbelief. Eleanor remained perfectly still, but for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely shaken. The confidence that had filled the room at the beginning of dinner had vanished. They had spent years believing I was the weakest person at the table, only to discover they had never truly known me at all. I stood from my chair, picked up the unsigned agreement, and placed it back in front of Eleanor. Then I calmly told her that I never wanted the Sterling fortune because I had already built everything I needed with my own hands. The only thing I had hoped to earn from this family was respect, and that was the one thing money could never buy. They had judged me before learning my story, and now they had to live with the consequences of those choices. Nathan finally stepped toward me with tears in his eyes. He admitted that he had failed me in the moments when I needed him most. He confessed that he spent years trying to keep peace inside his family instead of protecting the woman he promised to stand beside. I could hear the regret in every word, but I also knew some mistakes leave scars that apologies cannot erase overnight. I gently told Nathan that I still cared about him, but love could never survive without trust and courage. Whether our marriage had a future would depend on what he chose to become after that night, not on what he said while everything around him was falling apart. Then I walked toward the front door without looking back. The cold November air felt lighter than it had in years, and with every step away from the mansion, I felt another piece of the weight disappear from my shoulders. As I drove through the iron gates, I looked once in the mirror at the estate growing smaller behind me. For years I believed I needed a place at their table to prove my worth. That night I finally understood the truth. I had never needed their approval because I had already built a table large enough for people who valued character over status, respect over wealth, and kindness over pride. That was the greatest victory I could ever claim, and no contract in the world could take it away from me.